So I'm very glad to have with me today our good friend and a member of our church. Kamille has been a member of our church for a couple of years now and is very active in our church and leadership, has been taking growing in faith classes and is on our church council and has been a big help on our church council. We now constitutionally required to have a young adult. So luckily we have a young adult in our church. And so Cam has been able to provide us with that perspective, which is very valuable. So Cam is with me today for us to talk a little bit about gender, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and to kind of give a 101 video for people who need to understand what these terms mean. You want to say something more about yourself?
Yes, so I'm a member, as Pastor Jim said, I'm a member of St. Paul's. I'm a member of the council. I am, I guess you could say, a deacon in training while I apply for
Yeah.
the internship. And I am also a transgender man, and I have been since I've been living as a male since 2012, since I graduated high school. So that's been quite some time, but it's been on my mind since I was a very young child.
Hmm.
So I have been living in the world as a male for quite some time now, long before it was hitting the news, and I have a little bit of insight
Hmm.
into our lives and our experiences as trans people, and I would like to share that insight with y'all.
These are things that people have said to me about the reservations that they have, about the concerns that they have. And they're getting these from an effort on social media to kind of push these ideas. So the first one, people think that, they always bring up, and even in our church, you've told me that people have brought this up to you. What about children?
The thing about children is that there's two sides to this. One is that children know from a very early age. They say they know by the time they're about 5 who they are and what they're comfortable with. And that might sound a little bit antithetical if you've ever raised teenagers. I know I was a teenager, I had all sorts of phases, but they know on a very core basis who they are and what they're about at a very young age. And certainly I knew at 5 years old, this isn't right. I'm not a girl. This isn't right. I don't want to wear a dress to school. I grew up in British education, so we had school uniforms, and I was not into wearing the dresses. I insisted on trousers, and thankfully my school obliged and never got me on any misconduct for that.
Mhm.
So that's one thing is that children know at a very young age. The other thing is that they can't make any permanent decisions at that age legally.
Mhm.
There's no legally and medically, there's no permanent decisions they can make. So if they want to go by one name, that's not permanent.
Mhm.
They're not allowed to by themselves. They're underage. They can't go change their names. It's a very difficult process to change your name. It's very expensive, and it requires you to be over the age of 18.
Mhm.
Among many other things, depending on where you live. So they can't change their name legally, right? So they don't have to deal with that. Um, they can't receive any permanent altering medication or any permanent altering surgeries under the age of 18, legally and by strong medical standard. Um, None of this is accessible to them. What they can do is extremely reversible. They can ask parents and teachers and friends to call them what they prefer to be called, and that's harmless. That's reversible. I mean, I've had so many nicknames growing up under any gender identity, and that is all very, I used to be called Rooster in high school. Nobody calls me that anymore, and that was very temporary and very harmless to move away from that. There's no harm in them experimenting with different terminology because there's nothing permanent they can do about it. And even
Mhm.
then, research shows that children know at a very young age in a core sense who they are.
And all children explore identity.
Right. Growing up is all about exploring your identity
Yeah.
and
You
the
start
way
dressing
that you
up like
do
a
it.
cowboy. You start, dressing up
Right.
like, you get the glasses that you want because they make you feel a certain way.
And you only know that because you tried it.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think
You
that's the
try it
big
on.
thing. You only know you like dressing in a certain way because you tried it once. You looked at yourself in the mirror and you said, "Hey, that's cool. I like that
Yeah.
outfit. I
Yeah.
should wear this shirt more."
Yeah.
You only know that you like, for anyone who's into subcultures, you only know that you like being in a certain subculture because you went out and hung out with some people and tried it.
Yes.
That's what growing up is all about, is
Hmm.
discovering these things for yourself.
Yeah. You
And
try being a goth for a year and
right, if you like it, then hey, guess
Mhm.
what? You can be a goth. Good for you. That's a whole rich lineage you're going
Yeah.
into. And
Yeah.
I think the cool thing about growing up is that you have ideally you have a safe environment at
Mhm.
school and with
Mhm.
your friends to explore these things for
Mhm.
yourself. I mean, no kid likes being told what to do or who to be.
Yeah.
And even if you try, it's not going to work. It's not going to stick. And kids will find these things out for themselves, whether you force it on them or not. It's just a matter of how much friction are they going to get for trying this out? How much friction are they going to get for being themselves?
Yeah.
Ideally, it's less.
Yeah. So the other thing that people often come up with is that a lot of people regret it when they go through a transition. So they just kind of have that anecdotally. They don't know anything about that actually.
So the regret rate for transition is astronomically low. It is, so let's talk about, for example, so there's multiple kinds of transition, right? You can transition socially, which is what most people try first. You can transition medically. And that's when go on testosterone or estrogen. That's when you get surgeries, things like that. So there's different types of transition when we talk about it. So the first thing I did was transition socially. So I told all my friends, hey, this is my name. Use he, him pronouns for me. Let's try this out. Let's see how we like it, right? I'll see how I like it. I don't care what you guys think, but I'll see how I like it. Um, and I think the problem with this rhetoric is that it talks about regret rates. So let's talk about the things that are irreversible. So certain aspects of going on hormone replacement therapy are irreversible. My voice will always sound like this. Even if I lose access to testosterone, my voice will always sound like this. I will always have facial hair, right? So those two things are not going away. My face shape, however, if I went off testosterone, it might change again. I might be losing hair a little less quickly, but those two things are permanent, right? So what is the regret rate of that? It is less than 1%. So let's compare it with the regret rate of, say, knee surgery. Knee surgery has a pretty high regret rate. People who have knee surgery, and usually these are people who are in immense pain and people who can't really get along in everyday life without this immense pain and need the help, that has a high regret rate. I want to say it was something about 20%, but I'm going to have to fact check that. But that has a high regret rate. Back surgery and lower back pain is something that is completely disabling. If you have chronic lower back pain, that changes you as a person, that changes what you can access, right? Back surgery also has a high regret rate. So what about testosterone? Astronomically low regret rate. What about gender affirming surgeries? Also less than 1%. Less than 1% of people who get gender affirming surgeries regret having it, which is a medical miracle. There is no other surgery that can boast that kind of low rate of regret. And the fact that we have these surgeries is life-saving as well. So these people are, I mean, personally, I didn't think that I was going to be impacted that much by surgery, and it actually completely changed my life. Now I have access to, I can go to the gym without having to worry about anything. I can play hockey without having to worry about anything. It gave me, I can go swim, right? And these are things that I did not have access to because I didn't have surgery. And
Yeah,
that's just, I mean, that's anecdotal, but the statistics are there.
yeah, that's personal.
Miraculously low regret rates. This
Yeah,
is a medical miracle.
yeah. So there are people who are coming up with these ideas that, this is a sudden social thing that's happening. People think that teachers are convincing their students to do this, or parents are convincing their kids to do this, or YouTube influencers are convincing people to do this. And once you take away that one person, or I don't know if they think it's peer pressure, maybe that you just have to take somebody out of that contact with that person. So that's another thing that people come up with. So so a big issue is sports. There's a
Right.
lot that some very progressive people will hold out on that. They'll say, okay, I'm all in favor of not discriminating against people for employment or for anything else and allowing them to have gender affirming care, but they can't play sports.
This is an issue of access to regular everyday life.
Mhm.
This is something that people might not think about, but that is restricting us from participating in life to its fullest extent. I am an athlete. I play hockey. I also run, right? So running, that doesn't matter. I get changed in my house. But hockey, I go to the locker room. I change in front of the guys and the girls. We're a co-ed team. First of all, we share the locker room. We're adults.
Mhm.
Nothing happens. That's it.
Mhm. Mhm.
There's beers. That's it. It's hockey, right?
Mhm.
But the other thing is that when we talk about a lot of this discussion comes up in context of school athletes. So because schools have gendered facilities, right? It's not like a rink where you're assigned to locker room 8. It's, gendered facilities. So you have the the male locker room and the female locker room. And schools then have to determine, well, where is a student going to be put? And they're thinking about all these safety issues. I think first and foremost is that trans people are by far more likely to be victims of violence than they are to be perpetrators of
Hmm.
violence. So
Hmm.
we are more likely to be assaulted in a locker room than we are to assault someone else.
Hmm.
Um, Disproportionately compared to the cisgender population, people who identify as the gender that they were born as and are assigned at birth,
Hmm.
right? The other thing that's worth considering is that when we
Would
talk
you say what
about
cisgender is? You just threw out a term cisgender. I forgot to put that in my
Oh yeah,
slide.
cisgender is you were assigned this gender at birth and you continue to identify that way.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that is cisgender. So
Yeah.
that could be, I mean, the phrase that a lot of people use is normal, but I think that's a bit of it's a bit of an overstatement.
Yeah. It's a little loaded.
Cisgender is just a way to differentiate people of trans experience and people of not trans
Hmm.
experience.
Um, I think that locker rooms are problematic. If everyone is cisgender and heteronormative, they're problematic. And if it's
Right.
schools, it's like, do you have adult supervision or not? That's problematic. And if you don't have supervision, there's all kinds of harassment that's going on and abuse
I
as
mean,
happens in schools anyway.
the issue with the harassment is largely trans people being harassed.
Yeah,
And that's something
yeah.
that they usually do have adult supervision in an academic atmosphere. But when we're talking about trans people in academic sports, I believe the last NCAA figures we're talking about 10 people, 1-0.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking about 10 people, none of whom are particularly impressive athletes, none of whom are record breaking, none of whom
Mm-hmm.
are any more competitive than their peers, right? None of them are blasting records left and right. We're not talking about, it's hard to have a discussion about fairness in sports because
Yeah,
sports aren't fair.
yeah.
People have biological advantages. I'm 5'4" and I'm in a hockey team playing against these guys who are 6 foot something,
Mm-hmm.
right? I have a disadvantage. But at the same time, um, we're talking about legislating 10 people out of their lives. This is targeted harassment at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not trying to be political. I'm giving you the very real numbers from NCAA, and they're the
Yeah,
first people to say,
yeah.
exactly how many trans people they have. They have 10.
So people talk about this as if somebody's going to transition in order to do better at a sport.
I mean, if they want to be harassed in other in other realms of life, I mean,
It's,
if
it's just, yeah,
if
it's
that's
just
what you want to
ludicrous
go
that
through,
somebody
but
would do that just to get into the Olympics or something. It doesn't make any sense.
right. And then I think the thing that we're talking about when we're talking about people transitioning just to get into somewhere, right? That's a rhetoric you get with bathroom access too. Is that
Yeah,
what if a man wanted to transition just to get access to a woman's bathroom?
yes,
I mean, nothing's stopping him from just
yeah,
walking into the woman's bathroom.
yeah,
And if he wanted to transition to do that, he's looking at years of therapy, right?
yeah, yeah,
Years of therapy, years of trying to get letters, years of trying to push paperwork. And this
yeah,
is an arduous process that stops even the most, you know, hardworking and protective trans people from getting access to care that they actually need.
yeah,
And so why would someone with bad intentions bother to do that when he can just walk into the bathroom instead?
yeah. It's a really lazy rhetorical.
Right.
So the other thing you mentioned hockey, I read somewhere that when kids are in school and they sign up for the hockey team, if they're born in June, it's a big difference from if they're born in December because of
Yeah.
the cutoff date.
Yeah. Hockey is very age based. Like they sort you based by age for the most part for a long period of your development. So I didn't start playing until I was an adult, but I know a little bit about kind of the developmental process for hockey, and it's very you get the additional months are extremely helpful.
Yeah, like the top hockey athletes all fit into a very fortuitous
Yeah.
calendar of this month as opposed to 3 months later or something like that.
And talk about the lack of fairness in sports. They also are lucky enough to have parents who could afford all the gear. We're talking thousands of dollars
Yeah,
that they grow out of
yeah,
every few years.
yeah,
And they're lucky enough to be able to afford ice time, team dues. I mean, that's already unfair.
yeah,
So
yeah,
talking about fairness in sports aren't fair.
yeah.
You can
So,
even the playing field, but
yeah.
we have to compete still.
So the idea that parents are upset that somebody's going to be having an advantage over their kid says just how invested they are in their kid beating everybody else.
Right. But I mean, winning isn't everything in sports, and that's the same for, being trans in general. We're not doing that to get more access to life or more
Yeah,
access to anything. We're doing it to get the same access that everybody else has,
yeah. Some people though they want to win at any way of winning.
right?
So that's the people who are coming up with those arguments. So this is our welcome statement that we've had for almost 6 years now, and it is something that conforms to Reconciling Works, which is a pan-Lutheran organization that helps people to understand how to be accepting and affirming and having full access and full equality for people. So this has been very helpful for us. We have this on the cover of our bulletin every week. Now, Reconciling Works has also asked that people wanting to be recognized as members of Reconciling Works should also be anti-racist. So we've been doing work on that as well. We don't have it in this statement.
I really enjoy the language in this because something that I'm looking for when I, as a trans person, right, as a trans person, as a gay person, whatever the case may be, what I'm looking for when I'm looking for a church, and this is how I found St. Paul's, by the way, is I'm looking for explicit language that says, you specifically, you, the trans person, are welcome here, right? You specifically, you, the gay person, are welcome here. I
Mhm.
feel like it's really easy for churches to put out language saying, we welcome all, and then leave it at that.
Yeah,
And what happens in those situations is there's plausible deniability there, right?
yeah, yeah.
And I feel like the church that takes the extra step to say we welcome specifically these people in addition to everyone else we welcome. I feel like that overt language is really important in positing ourselves as an affirming congregation. And it sold me. That's how I found St. Paul's was through Reconciling Works.
So Reconciling Works here is this is some from their page. So that's the Lutheran organization, Lutherans for Full Participation. So they have a lot of resources, which we're going to get to. And they've been doing work going back to before the ELCA was accepting gays and lesbians. They were a part of the effort to move that along. So this is the progressive pride flag.
Something that's interesting about these inclusions of the black and brown community and the transgender community, that's what if you were wondering what the black, brown, blue, pink, white is, the black, brown is for people of color,
Yeah.
and the blue, pink, and white is the color of the transgender flag.
Mhm.
And the transgender community started, a lot of the discussion around gay marriage was coming up, and the transgender community kind of felt a little bit othered and
Mhm.
not really included in this discussion because we're still talking about our access to,
Yeah.
basic medical care and things like
Yeah.
that. They decided, like, hey, we should call out specific communities who were instrumental in establishing pride as a protest at first,
Mhm.
which includes, the people of color and the transgender people who were at Stonewall and who were, in the village and just defending their right to be in public.
Yeah. I mentioned the Reconciling Works organization. So they have 1,000 member congregations, either congregations or some kind of worshiping community. So that's a pretty small percentage overall. It is growing all the time. Um, so that's their webpage, and you can go to that webpage to find organizations. So I just met with a couple about a baptism, and they said that they Googled gay accepting congregations, and there's a list that maybe you've seen. There's a list that has like a database of congregations that have signed up for that. So we've had a number of people who found our congregations because they Googled something about an accepting congregation. So I just wanted to talk about, the flag has been evolving, but the whole idea of societal acceptance has been evolving. That when I was, born, homosexuality was still criminalized in much of the United States. Doctors still referred to homosexuality as a disorder. And, there was a lot of stigma and there was a lot of religious language that talked down about the gay community. So the changes have come very recently. So decriminalizing came in 2003 with the Supreme Court decision on June 26th, and taking the designation as a medical disorder out of the Diagnostic Manual for Psychologists. That came out in 1973 in the United States. The ELCA only removed the prohibition against people serving in ministry in 2009. And there's a lot of problems with the way in which they did that, and they're still kind of trying to make advances in being more accepting. But all of that is very recently. I mean, I was ordained for 9 years before they did that.
Right.
So I remember all those debates and those discussions, and they were very long out, drawn out discussions. They were very difficult discussions. There were people who left. There were congregations that left. It was a very, very painful process. And then just discrimination in terms of marriage equality was just 10 years ago. And we know none of these gains are irreversible. And a lot of these gains we've taken a step forward, and we seem to have taken a step back already, and threats to take a step back. So it's been difficult. So I wanted to talk about gender versus sex, and gender expression versus gender identity. So people imagine that your sex and your gender go together, that if you're one, then you're going to be the other. But just to pull them out and to say that sex, and of course we use the word sex to refer to sexual intercourse, right? So that's, you got to pull that apart, just to say that sex is male and female. And gender identity and gender expression, you're talking about masculine and feminine, man and woman. So everybody knows that you have males who are more feminine, you have females who are more masculine, and people all along the spectrum of that. So there's all kinds of ways in which society stigmatizes people if they don't align up in terms of those two. But the educational process is really about trying to get people to think about how these are discrete things, and that neither one of them is binary. That, you know, some people who we're not going to name talk about you're either male or you're female, and that's the only two options. We know medically, we know historically that that's not true. And masculine and feminine are not binary, and they're fluid, and they go along a spectrum. A lot of people probably don't even know what LGBTQIA stands for. So this is just one example of a lot of things you could find if you looked it up online. That Q could be for queer or for questioning, that I is for intersex, that A could be for ally or asexual. So 5 of these refer to sexuality, 3 or 4 of them refer to identity. So that's kind of an example of the spectrum. So again, male and female does not always line up with masculine and feminine. And then sexual orientation is a different thing, right? So people don't even know that those are 3 separate things, that
Right.
you might have one sexual orientation and another gender and another sex, that you can't line those things up in any way.
I mean, if I may, I think of it this way. Sex is what the doctor said you were when you were born, right? That's really difficult to change that on your birth certificate, even if they got it wrong, which often happens. And that kind of goes to show that it's not really a strict binary. There's a lot of there's a lot of wiggle room biologically, scientifically. If you ask any biologist, are humans male or female? Is there only 2 sexes? They'd be like, no. There's actually a really huge spectrum of what we call sex characteristics in humans. And so it's not, you can't even narrow it down to an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, because a lot of people who you would otherwise have no idea, they have an XXY. And that's very common. It's very common. It's
Mhm.
common enough that we can't really narrow down sex to just male and female.
Yeah, yeah. Science is so politicized and so weaponized, and but for me, I'm trying to get across the idea that people don't want to break out of this binary, and they don't want to break out of the idea that you need to have the same sex and the same gender. So to me, what they're saying is that your genitalia decides your gender. That's what people want to believe. That's what
Right.
the normative way of thinking of it has been for a long time. So we do kind of, think very reductively about the body as
Right.
determining gender.
One example we can use in the legal world is a lot of these states who are kind of championing this attack on trans people, who are kind of testing out how far they can get, how much they can get away with legally. Missouri, they introduce legislation that says things like a woman is defined as someone who can give birth. Now,
Mm,
immediately, I see a big problem with that. You talk about,
yeah,
what about menopausal women,
yeah,
right? What about women who have never been able to give birth and
yeah,
never would?
yeah.
But they've always been women. They were born, they were born female and never identified any other way, right?
Hmm.
Never wanted to.
Hmm.
And so you immediately have a problem with that. But legally, that's the kind of tricky situation they try to, paint us into is, well, we're going to define it this way, and then biologically it makes no sense. Rationally, it makes no sense because we know, I mean, a menopausal woman is still a woman, right? That doesn't stop happening just because she's in
Yeah,
menopause. It doesn't,
yeah,
that's not the case.
yeah. So society has very rigid notions of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man. They're very, very oppressive notions that everybody is struggling to try to conform to, and nobody quite conforms to, or
Right.
nobody can feel really secure in their conforming to it, you know?
I mean, think about how recently we've been able to have women wearing pants at work.
Mm-hmm,
That's
mm-hmm.
pretty recent. I
Yeah,
mean, I still have teachers in my childhood who weren't allowed to wear pants.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, there are workplaces where they still have dress codes that are very
Yeah.
gendered.
I think that's and th this is really nascent and th this is nascent and a little bit dicey because it's hard to prove until someone dies. So
Mm,
basically they had determined that in transgender people upon death, because this is the only time you can figure this out, they have a very similar brain structure or the same brain structure as the gender they chose to be. So a trans man, if he died and got and was had his brain inspected, basically, so again, something you can only do when someone dies. So there's
hmm
limited research. They have found that he will have, as far as we can tell, the closest thing you can get to a biologically male brain.
hmm hmm
And this is still nascent because there's we have a long history of transgender people being persecuted, so we kind of live in the closet, right?
hmm
So this is one thing that we like to talk about in the trans community is that trans people have always existed. We've always been around, you just didn't know that we were trans. So for example, the first surgeon to successfully perform a C-section was born a woman, and he decided to change that sometime over his life. At the time, there was no medical procedure he could do.
hmm
He started going by a male name, started going by he, him, and became a surgeon. At the time, only men could become surgeons. And he was the first doctor in the West, mind you, to perform a successful C-section where the mother survived. And that was in the 1800s.
Yeah, yeah,
The only difference is he wasn't really allowed to be out about it.
yeah.
And so people like to talk about, well, there's these trends. There's so many more trans people. There's so many more gay people. I think the
hmm
only difference is we feel safe telling people that we're trans or gay.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a safety factor here because we've always existed. I don't think the number is any different than it historically has been. Um, if you were to ask someone in confidence and have their trust,
Yeah,
I think the difference is that now it's a lot safer for us to say these things out loud. At the same time,
yeah,
with
yeah,
additional visibility is additional danger.
yeah. So something about your gender is something connected to your brain. It's something connected to your soul.
Right.
It's something that you feel. It's not something that you look down in your pants and decide that that's what tells you what you are. So
Right.
there was a doctor in the 60s and 70s who families were coming to him because they were concerned about their children's genitalia, that it was not definitive to them, right? They're like, this genitalia does not conform to what we expect it to be. And that this doctor on his own would decide what he could do and would assign a gender to that child surgically. And that later on in life, these children would feel, this sense that my gender does not match who I am. And then with their parents, maybe didn't even tell them until that point. Well, we assigned a gender to you. It was ambiguous. We didn't want to leave it ambiguous. We had to decide, and this doctor helped us. That you can't just have genitalia tell a person who they are
Right.
by gender, and that whole story kind of confirms that.
Those kind of surgical assignments for people who are kind of unsure what their child's sex is, it still happens.
Yeah,
And it's now there's growing medical consensus that that's coercive and that's,
yeah,
kind of torture for the child
yeah,
because oftentimes they'll grow up and they'll think that this is not me.
yeah, yeah. So that was the
And that's
first time
something
I,
they can't consent to.
yeah. So I had kind of heard about that. I think in the 80s that there was this guy who was thinking he could assign gender,
Right.
and people when they were getting older. And I think there was another guy who took twins and like as an experiment tried to assign a gender to one of them as like an experiment to see what would happen or something. So this is from a pamphlet that was put out by Reconciling Works called Lutheran Introduction to Orientation, Identity, and Expression. So the first one is male, female, that their sex. And what you see here is a bar in the middle that represents that there's a spectrum from the left to the right, and there's stuff along that spectrum. And then separate from that is gender identity and gender expression. That your gender identity describes if you think of yourself as a man or a woman. And then again, it's a spectrum. There's this line, right? You've got the red on the left and the blue on the right, and there's shades in between. And that gender expression could be masculine, feminine, or something androgynous in between. And then sexual orientation is another spectrum that's separate from those, and that none of those need to inform the other one. You could be anywhere on any of those spectrums, left, right. It's not going to line up. Everyone is on the left, all of these, and all someone is on the right on all these, even though that's a societal expectation that many people have, and that people have not been educated about.
I think one way I might put it is that sex is who you are assigned at birth. That's essentially a government category. Gender, in both expression and identity, that's who you are, how you move about the world. And attraction, being heterosexual, homosexual, that's who you like. That's not has nothing to do with who you are, but that's who you are interested in, who you want to, date, who you have crushes on, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So the rabbi and I have been doing these workshops, these Pride Works workshops for between me and different rabbis and different priests and different ministers for like 15 years now. So one time the rabbi brought to the workshop this idea that Judaism is very gendered. You have to have a circumcision in order to become a Jew. And if you're a woman, you're supposed to be lighting candles at Sabbath. There's all these very gendered ways in which the rituals and being initiated into the community and so forth. That for a long time, the Jewish community, for centuries and centuries, the Jewish community, they've had to confront the fact that genitalia doesn't always match up, and that it doesn't always stay consistent over a person's lifetime. So in different traditions and different cultures, indigenous cultures or other cultures, they found ways to talk about this idea of gender or sex that's not a binary. This is not new. It's just a way in which our society has not been open to discussing the reality of it, and has kind of imposed a very set understanding that's very, very oppressive.
I think one interesting thing is androgynous shows up there. That's still used today, androgynous, to
Hmm.
refer to someone who you can't really easily assign them to male or female, masculine or feminine. So, I mean, we still have flexible language now. It's just a little different. This is a phrase that used to go around, I'm a man in a woman's body. That's
Hmm.
something that used to go around, for the older trans people, that was something that they would say. And that
Hmm.
was something that people could kind of grasp, right? I would point out at this juncture that in the
Okay.
rise of Nazi Germany, the first book burning
Hmm.
was the library of Magnus Hirschfeld, and he
Yeah.
was what at the time we would call a sexologist. He was doing incredibly, prescient research on gender reassignment.
Hmm.
And by burning that library and by hunting down all of the people who were involved in his research and him himself, we set back medical science by 60 years,
Yeah.
easily 60 years.
Yeah.
And that was the first Nazi book burning. They went straight for Magnus Hirschfeld's library because they knew what kind of research he was doing and they were very against it. And
Hmm.
so it's not like being trans and being persecuted is new, but
Hmm.
it is a very dark sign and it's a bad side. And something that I think that we as church should be concerned about is, Jesus asks us to minister to the least of us. He's very,
Hmm.
very concerned for the least of us. There are very few transgender people, and we have a disproportionately bad access to public life and to basic health services,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? So not only just transition related services, but regular health services are hampered because of our identities, because discrimination is very common and research isn't very widely shared.
Hmm.
So we have unique health requirements that are routinely not being met, right? And Jesus is very clear about what to do with the least of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's,
this is a matter for us. This is a matter of, as church, this is a matter of sacramental justice, who we welcome,
yeah.
right?
But I think this has been helpful. I think there are a lot of people who are hearing the wrong thing, and there are a lot of people who don't know where to get the right information from, and or don't have it presented in a way that's easy for them to get to and to understand. So Camille, I want to thank you very much for this time and
Of course.
for your ministry to our church, preaching for us and helping with worship, and we know that your ministry is going to develop and grow over the years, and that it's going to be a blessing to us, and we're grateful for that.
And thank you, Pastor Jim, for growing such a affirming and welcoming community and such an affirming and welcoming church.
We've been very lucky that we have people who've come together. Um, that you can't have the pastor leading a congregation to do something that they don't want.
Right.
To have a community where we could make a difference because people want to make a difference. Thank you so much, and God bless.
God bless.
All right, I'll talk to you soon.